Now let's bring in former DOJ prosecutor James Trusty for more on the Mueller investigation. James, thank you for joining us here today.
Happy to be here.
I know you've been watching this unfold since it happened, the plea deal with Manafort. The president has previously called the entire investigation, the Mueller investigation, a witch hunt. Then he tweets that it's illegal, not allowed under the law. Pretty strong response from the president. The White House also responding, saying essentially that this plea deal with Manafort had absolutely nothing to do with the president. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't know that you can use the word illegal that accurately at this situation. It is a lawful probe. It doesn't mean there's not a ton of legitimate questions about how the group got formed and how far they have kept within the scope of their mandate. But I think it shows some frustration and maybe a little bit of fear on behalf of the president that they've gotten into somewhat of an inner circle and they have someone who is belatedly choosing not to take a bullet for him again.
Is this plea deal a sign that Manafort may very well have some sort of information, some evidence that could hurt someone up the chain, closer to the president?
Yeah, you would think so. The bottom line is he's late in the game to plead guilty and to cooperate, but it's not unheard of. And he made that decision only after sitting down with the government. I can't imagine that they haven't already had a face-to-face with him. It looks like they probably did about a week ago. And so they had a chance to assess what he has and to figure out whether it adds up to something that they can use. And I don't think they're going to be focusing on historic old information that got him in harm's way in the first place. So I think it's probably more recent. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the president, but it's probably something that they felt was helpful to either a final report or to an indictment or to moving the investigation forward.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because I was wondering if this potentially could have to do with older crimes. This is someone who has been in touch with shady folks in Russia and in the Ukraine for many, many years. Could there be something involved with not just necessarily things he's been convicted for in the past, but with these other individuals and other people that know these folks?
Well, there is reporting that's out there that talks about bipartisan sleazery, that there may be other folks from both sides of the aisle that have engaged with the Russians or with pro-Russian forces in the Ukraine. But I think the reason they took the case in the first place against Manafort wasn't to necessarily avenge the wrongdoing from years ago, but it was to pressure him into cooperating with their probe. And so it's possible that it's older information, but I think it's more likely, if it has value to them now, it's more likely that it's something more recent, like from 2016.
So, you know, when you say something more recent, like 2016, I mean, do you mean, frankly, that it could have something potentially to do with the campaign? Or, that's the time frame you're talking about.
Well, the probe is supposed to be focusing on collusion and what was going on with the campaign, and there's some real issues about whether it strayed from that. But I think it's more likely that a person who has obstructed justice and has gone to trial would have more value to them if it's something that's less historical and a little bit more centered on their investigation.
So you think he might have something new?
Might be something newer than the old Ukraine stuff, at least.
There's also this long-floated idea that Manafort wouldn't cooperate because he ultimately wants that pardon down the road. So where does that leave us now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a guesswork that every one of these folks has to go through, which is whether or not they're going to get a pardon at the end of the day. I think it's pretty safe to assume anybody who's cooperating isn't going to get a pardon. That just doesn't seem to be the way this president's going to operate. So I think he may have made the assessment that it's not going to happen, that he's got some way to try to control the damage to himself by entering into this plea and giving up the ghost, and that's where we are.
All right, James Trusty, thanks so much for the legal insights. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
For reaction to our developments, we have former federal prosecutor himself. He worked at the Southern District of New York for 20 years on big cases like the Blind Shade case and the First Trade Center bombing. Andrew McCarthy, civil and criminal defense attorney David Schoen. Andy, let's start here with, I think, what is so obvious. How did we get from Russia collusion to 5 years of taxes in the case of Paul Manafort and tax and bank charges against him? And by the way, I'm advising everyone, pay your taxes, don't lie on loan applications, and don't lie to the FBI. 3 lessons we can take out tonight. How did we get from Russia collusion to this?
Sean, I agree with what you said about the two-tiered justice system, because I don't think you could justify how the same or similar cases have been handled on these 2 different categories of people. I'm not as convinced that what we started with was Russian collusion. I really think that what we started with was Russia's interference in the election, and that still
that's
is
what they were calling it,
supposed
though, right?
to be, at least. Well, no, they said the collusion was one thread of an investigation into Russia's involvement in the election. I'm pretty convinced that Mueller is not pursuing a collusion case against
it's an obstruction
President
case.
Trump. I think it is an obstruction case. And as far as Manafort goes, I don't think that I don't think Mueller thinks Manafort has anything with respect to Trump campaign collusion with Russia that Mueller couldn't already get from Gates, who is Manafort's partner, who's been cooperating for 6 months. I think his interest in Manafort has to do with exactly Manafort's connections to Russia, not necessarily the Trump campaign. And until I see something different, that's what I've concluded.
You know the Southern District of New York. I mean, it has the reputation of probably being, in terms of federal prosecution, the toughest one in the country. And you worked there 20 years, over 2 decades of your life. Rudy Giuliani worked there, interestingly. Very smart, aggressive, tough attorneys that worked there.
He hired me.
Oh, Rudy hired you? I didn't know.
Right.
Okay, we get some trivia in. But the heart of what they're saying, so I have all these examples where Michael Cohen had said that the president didn't know, that he did it on his own, and that he didn't do it with any expecting payback. Michael Cohen says today, at the direction of the president. There are numerous times that he said it. Why do I think that that was the special sauce that the prosecution wanted? Because remember, this was fed to them and served up to them by Robert Mueller. And again, we go to taxi medallions,
right.
Tax fraud. And another big question as a side note, if you can answer both. Would any of these people, Flynn, Papadopoulos, Manafort, or Cohen, be in trouble tonight in any way if it weren't for the issue of Russia, which didn't come up in any case?
Yeah, I think, Sean, I think the last question is the easiest one to answer. These guys got on the government's crosshairs because of their connections to first candidate and now President Trump. I don't think there's any question about that. But I do think that the Cohen case ended up in the Southern District because Mueller didn't see him, Cohen, as somebody who was going to advance his Russia investigation. And the Southern District had a different line of interest in Cohen.
But let's focus on the main. But when he says in the direction of the president, and he previously had not, why do I think that that had to be a big part of what they wanted from Cohen to get the deal he got? Because he was otherwise facing 65 years.
Yeah, but Sean, it's a straight-up guilty plea. It's not a cooperation agreement. I don't think they regard him as a witness. I think for precisely the reason you've pointed out, you know, he's made statements that are all over the map. They did elicit that from him today when he gave his allocution at his guilty plea. But I think if they regarded him as a valuable witness or a cooperator, you'd see a very different kind of plea agreement.
Yeah, I do agree with that, too. And, David, you've seen a lot of these cases over the years, and we talked about at length. Look, there are Russian issues here. Hillary paid for a phony Russian dossier with funneled money through a law firm to a op research group that hired a foreign national, which I thought was bad for our elections. And he came up with Russian lies that were disseminated to the American people to impact, that were never verified, never corroborated, to impact our election. And then such information was also used as the bulk of information to get FISA warrants on a Trump campaign associate. Russian lies were used, and I believe fraud was committed before 4 FISA court judges. None of these people, nor is Hillary Clinton, who I think has the most open and shut case on obstruction, none of them are indicted today. Why? Right. What should the American people take from that?
The answer why is purely a political one. I think the American people are entitled to hold the United States attorney to his word today when he said the message from the Cohen case is that the rule of law is to be applied equally and evenly across the board. We haven't seen that yet. Mr. McCarthy is exactly right that the mandate started out the question of Russian interference. I think the case today, Manafort, perfectly illustrates how wrong they went in the breadth of the mandate that was given, that Judge Ellis examined and found this case fell within that breadth. It's so far beyond that, has nothing whatsoever to do with the president, certainly, but the charges today, nothing whatsoever to do with Russia. And, of course, your original question, how did it get in the Southern District? We know, for example, a member of the Mueller team comes out of the unit that prosecuted Mr. Cohen. Andrew Goldstein comes from that unit. Let's hold the Southern District to their word, and let's get past these cases that have nothing to do with the president and get on with the business that you've reported day after day. The misconduct before the FISA court is outrageous. The American people cannot withstand that kind of treachery before that kind of secret court in an ex parte proceeding. We have to have the answers and full disclosure.
You know, isn't it happen every day, Andy McCarthy, that people that commit fraud on their taxes and people that commit campaign finance violations, Obama $2 million worth. Michael Cohen's about 300 grand. They only paid a $375,000 fine. I used the Hillary case. I used the fraud before the FISA judges. Andy, I wouldn't lie to any judge ever. It's dumb. I wouldn't also, if I had a subpoena by Congress for my emails, I wouldn't delete them. I wouldn't acid wash my hard drives and beat up or have somebody beat up my phones. And I think America has to look tonight and ask itself, is this a witch hunt, as the president is saying, based on what we know are real crimes, and some of them actually have to do with Russia?
Sean, I don't think anybody objective could look at the way that the Clinton emails investigation was handled and the way the Trump campaign has been pursued and say that there's a single standard of justice. I just don't see how that could be. At the same time, I don't want to see Mueller pursuing the investigators or what happened in the Hillary case. As I understand it, that's being looked at by the Justice Department, by the Inspector General, and by Mr. Huber, the U.S. Attorney from Utah, who the Attorney General assigned to this. I think we ought to let them do their work. I'd rather see them do it than see Mueller do it. I think Mueller should stay focused on what he's doing and bring it to an end.
All right, Andy McCarthy, David Schoen, thank you.